Now, I think that what happened to those two countries is the playbook for what they're trying to do here in America. And I think most
Yes.
Americans don't realize it, and they don't realize what it would mean. I've heard others talk about how in South Africa, they have, is it true that they have like over 150 laws, affirmative action type laws that discriminate against whites and keep—
I don't know the figure, but they certainly have them, yes. The only difference there between, say, the US and South Africa would be that in South Africa, affirmative action advances the majority, not the minorities, because the whites are the minority and the various black nations are the majority. So affirmative action is pushing a minority out and giving all kinds of privileges to the majority.
Now, do they have a law there? I seem to recall someone claiming that they passed a law that said 9 out of every 10 jobs must go to a person who is Black. Is that true? Or something like that?
I haven't heard of 9 out of 10. There are laws already in place, depending on the size of your business, that you have to have 75% Black employees, 2% disabled, I think, or whatever it might be, so many women, so many men. So already on the larger companies, they have to have, I think it is 75% Black employment. So not yet 90%, but who knows? They might be talking that way.
Wow. Okay, so 75%, that's still, you know,
it's high.
every 4 jobs. Yeah, that's very, very high.
Yeah. And of course, it's difficult to do because even 30 years after apartheid ended, the fact still remains that the majority of Black people do not have as yet the qualifications for those jobs. So it puts these companies in a difficult position to find enough qualified Black people to hold the jobs, not because they can't do it, but because they haven't as yet reached that standard of education that would make it possible.
Is it true that Nelson Mandela sabotaged education for the Blacks in South Africa because he wanted to have citizenship and voting rights before they were educated? Is that true?
Yes. Well, he was in prison, so more his party than him, although they would have consulted him. But in 1976, we had riots across the country where Black school children refused to learn in, say, the Afrikaans language, and they started burning schools down. And the liberation, let's call it the terrorist slogan that was heard at the time was, liberation now, education later. So an entire generation of Black young people lost the opportunity for any education at all, at least at high school level and beyond that. And those same young men in 1976 are now middle-aged and older Black men who cannot find work of any sort that would pay any kind of decent wage. So we're looking at close to 40% unemployment or higher in the country.
Now, do you think that the Marxists did this because they wanted ignorant people that they could manipulate?
Yeah. That's exactly why. That's exactly why. We shouldn't have any doubt about that. Excuse me. The Marxists have always known that they either use education or they destroy it. Either way, it works for them. If they can control it, just like many years ago, they used to say, I think in China, the missionaries taught us to read, but the Chinese communists gave us the books. Well, then the education would be communist education. But where they can't do that, they'd rather burn down the educational institutions and stop people going to them to keep them ignorant and uneducated, which makes them essentially cannon fodder for the revolution, which is what they were.
Now, what's really fascinating about what you talk about in your book on the Jesuits, this, and you call it the secret army of the papacy. And I think it's a very important part of what you specifically cover. And of course, other historians like J.A. Wiley, J.C. Ryle, and others have talked about this. There's even a quote from John Adams where he's writing to Jefferson, and after the Jesuits were reinstated in 1814, or maybe you can talk about their abolishment, but there's a quote from Adams where he says, "Will we not have swarms of them here in as many disguises as only a king of the gypsies could assume," right? Because, and then he says they all different sorts of races, professions, and so on, that they don't necessarily appear as priests with a collar.
No, not at all.
So 2 questions. One, can you talk about why they were abolished by the Pope in 1773? And then 2, their methods of secrecy.
Right. Well, they were abolished because the hatred of the European nations, Papist nations, increased against the Jesuits to the point where they demanded that the Pope do something. Because as time went by, they realized that this order of men was wreaking havoc in their own countries. So they called on the Pope more and more, and the voices got louder and louder. The popes were frightened and didn't want to do it, understandably. And one of them did. But even in abolishing the order, he admitted that he signed his death warrant, essentially. And sure enough, a few months later, he was dead. And in a particularly unpleasant way, which looks like poisoning. So they were abolished for a time in virtually all European countries, including the Roman Catholic ones. Gradually, they snuck back in, but it took time. And but they recovered from that, but it was a blow for them at the time.
All right, so then they're reinstated in 1814. They come back.
Right.
And one of the methods, and you talk about this pretty extensively, is their methods of secrecy.
Yes. They, as you said earlier, they don't have to appear as a priest with a Jesuit's dog collar on and dressed in black. Depending on what their task is, they can appear in all kinds of disguises. So, for example, they have been involved in banking and commerce. They've been involved in politics, in all kinds of spheres of influence, newspapers, the media, and in particular, of course, infiltrating Protestant denominations and churches. Now, they've been very good at that. It's extremely difficult to know for certain who they might be. And it's more a case of looking at the evidence of individual preachers and pastors and saying, what were they doing and how were they working? And it certainly looks like Jesuit influence, whether they are Jesuits themselves or whether they're just influenced by it. But from the very beginning of the Jesuit order, they have infiltrated Protestant churches, rising up within the Bible colleges, the seminaries, universities, and even in the pulpits, so that they can move these denominations away from biblical truth, which is exactly what we see in the world today and how it has happened, and they have been very successful at it.
Now, you also believe that, and of course, when I say you believe, there's an overwhelming amount of documentation for the assertion that the Jesuits were behind the assassination of Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And that John Wilkes Booth was an agent
a
of
Jesuit
theirs.
tool.
Yeah.
Yeah, very much so.
Why do you believe that?
As you said, for the overwhelming evidence. Most people, if they know anything about that, will know it from the book by Charles Chinnicky, 50 Years in the Church of Rome. It's an excellent book, and I think he does do a very good job of proving it. But what many people don't know is he was not the only one. There were others who also went into it, studied the issue, and came up with the evidence. And when you go back earlier than Lincoln's assassination, you see him saying that he feels this would happen to him at the hands of the Jesuits. and he gives the reasons why. So there's a lot of evidence, as you say, it's overwhelming that that was the reason for the assassination of Lincoln.
And why do you think they wanted to kill Lincoln? Do you think, now the Jesuits, they supported slavery, didn't they?
They did, and supported the South also in the Civil War. So Lincoln was probably on their radar for more than one reason. Certainly because of the abolition of slavery, possibly even because of his friendship with Chiniki, and even his morality. I'll say that at least, that he took a stand on things, and was an honest man, and a man, whatever else may be said about him. So I think it all mostly had to do with Civil War issues, and possibly even international politics at the time, the relationship of the United States with Protestant Europe, and not only Protestant Europe, but France and things like that.
Mm. Now, you also write about the Jesuits coming into the 20th century. There's a number of books about the Jesuits' involvement in World War I, or Rome's involvement especially, and presumably the Jesuits, because they've run the Vatican for well over 100 years. And you also recommend on your website the book, The Vatican Against Europe.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the world wars, World War I and World War II?
Yes. Both wars, the Roman Catholic system was very deeply involved, and the influence of the Jesuits is more easily seen in World War II, although, as you said, it surely was there in World War I as well. But in both wars, the Vatican backed Germany and certain other powers. The purpose being to take control of Europe and the world, as they had often tried to do in the past and had succeeded in doing in Europe, and wanting to do it again, but using the most powerful nation in Europe at the time, which was Germany. And when that failed in World War I, moving on to preparations for World War II. Hitler, as is played down today, but was a Roman Catholic from Austria, a very Jesuit part of the German nation. He had a lot of influence from them. Himmler, his right-hand man, had an uncle who was a Jesuit. Hitler said of Himmler, "I see in Himmler my Ignatius of Loyola," the founder of the Jesuits. And Hitler actually pretty much fashioned the Gestapo along Jesuit lines. And that's just some of the evidence. There's a lot more. So very much they were involved in that, to the extent that even after World War I, at the Treaty of Versailles, the Allied powers wanted to deny the Vatican a place there because they knew its involvement in World War I. And of course, World War II, and the pretty much the Jesuit state of Croatia, which was a Nazi state, but which committed atrocities that at times made the Nazis of Germany look like they were in kindergarten. It was a terrible time, and it was run by a Jesuit, as was Slovakia. So then you see that being repeated in the 90s, when again Croatia and Serbia went to war. So the influence of the Vatican in general, the Jesuits in particular, in these wars is immense.
You think one of the things that I've studied is the situation, the war in Bosnia during the Clinton administration, and how that began. According to the people who reject the official narrative, the Serbs argue that what happened is there were these Muslim jihadis. They started raping and murdering all of these Serbian Christian civilians and killed several thousand of them. And then the Serbs fought back, and chased down these Muslim jihadis, killed them, But then the media twisted it around to make it look like the Serbians were guilty of some horrible atrocity against the poor Muslims and tried to make the Muslims look like the victims. Do you know this whole argument? What what is behind?
I actually carry on.
Sure, go ahead.
I think that what happened in the 90s in that part of the world was a direct carryover from what happened in World War II. Because in World War II, the Croatians, who were Roman Catholics, massacred the Serbs, who were Eastern Orthodox for the most part, and I think about 800,000 or 900,000 of them were murdered. The Serbs never forgot that, and in the 90s, when this all started again, and not just with Bosnia and the Muslims, but even again with the Croats and the Roman Catholics there, that the Serbs were thinking to themselves, we're not going to see this happen again like we saw in World War II. I think that with certainty there were probably atrocities on both sides of the conflict in the 90s, but you're dealing with people that, again, calling themselves Christians. Roman Catholics call themselves Christians, Eastern Orthodox do. Neither side is, and so the biblical teachings of turning the other cheek and so on are not applied there. And so there was a lot of trouble on both sides. But yes, I think the Serbians were badly done by the world at the time, and were made out to be the bad guys. And I say that thinking that they probably were not as innocent as they'd like us to think. But at the same time, the other side was certainly not innocent. And yet the media, the world media, and the West, again, made it look like the Serbs were the aggressors and the Muslims and the Croats were the innocent people. It's happened throughout history. It happened again in 1994 in Rwanda, again, a Roman Catholic African country that descended into chaos. And it was, again, the media that played up one side against the other, whereas in fact it was Rome that was behind that.
Can you talk about that, the Rwanda genocide? I first learned about that from an article on the website of the late Dr. Ian Paisley, his European Institute of Protestant Studies, talking about the role of Rome. I'd never heard about it.
I know, Rwanda was in many ways similar to South Africa in the sense that there were two predominant tribes, the Tutsis and the Hutus. Roman Catholicism was very influential in both sides. The Tutsis were the more educated but the minority. The Hutus were the majority, and priests from Belgium and other countries in Europe stirred up the Hutus to attack the Tutsis. Interestingly, they did it in the very month that South Africa was holding the 1994 elections. So that brought Mandela to power. So the whole world media focus was on South Africa, not little Rwanda further up north. And they were able to get away with it because the media just were not there. And 1 million people died within weeks, to the point that the rivers were flowing with corpses and blood. And many of these poor people were dupes of the priests. In fact, priests and nuns were involved in those massacres and were killing people themselves in many cases. After the war, they fled to Europe. They hid in Belgium. There were various men who were priests there. They lived there for years until they were recognized by victims of the genocide and often had to stand trial for it.
What do you think of the President Paul Kagame, who has been the president of Rwanda? He seems like a very good guy. He's the guy who's credited with having stopped the genocide when nobody else would. He takes over the country. Now it's being said that he's turned the whole country around. It's one of the more successful countries in Africa. What do you think about his leadership and what's happening there now?
I think from what I've seen of it, and possibly here in Africa, we get some of that news that's maybe not everywhere else, but I think he could be described as I would almost say a benign dictator, but benign is too kind. I think he is ruthless, but at the same time, he has turned the country around. He has turned it into an economic success story, but really you can't oppose him. He's brutal at the same time. So it's one of those cases that we've often had in Africa. Malawi comes to mind, others where there were dictators who in one area would be good for the country and in other areas would not. So it's a mixed bag, I think.
Hmm. Do you think that some of his ruthlessness is trying to keep back? Because I've heard these accusations as well, or assertions,
yeah.
And I've thought, that he's trying to restrain the
Right.
Hutu radicals, because there are people who say that when he's gone,
yeah,
there could be another repeat of the Rwanda.
There could be, yeah. And I think that is a valid point, that this may be behind much of what he does there. And yes, when he dies or when he goes, there's really not much stopping it from going back to how it was. And that's always been the problem in Africa, the whole tribalism issue, and the fact that your tribe comes first. So everywhere sits on a powder keg in this continent. It really does.
Now, that's very interesting that you say that, because the media, the presentation in the media, tribalism is something that in the West they call racism.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And yet we're being told that it's the white people who are the real horrible, evil racists. Yet from stories that I've heard and histories, the tribalism in Africa is much, much worse. Is that accurate?
Yes, it's very accurate. In fact, before what was called the scramble for Africa in the late 1880s, when various European powers took over the whole continent, before that, Africa was no paradise. It was a violent, brutal place to be, and that a lot of that was put to rest by the European powers. That's not to say they did everything right, and in fact, many of them were extremely brutal. But for a time, anyway, Africa advanced because of European colonialism, and people will call that racist, but that's the fact of it. Once they left, and pretty much they've left everywhere except South Africa now, Africa descended into chaos again, and we had one brutal dictator after another. I remember growing up in Rhodesia, and apart from Mugabe and the problems there, as a boy, I heard all the things that were being done in Uganda and Zaire and one country after another, and people pouring over the borders into Rhodesia to try and get safety and to get away from what was happening to the north. And then the same thing happened here, and as in America, with the people from Latin America coming across the borders. We are still having the same problem here, with people pouring into South Africa from other African countries, which are far worse than we are, and looking for a better life.
And I've heard different things about the history of South Africa. And I talked to a South African minister several years ago, and he told me that many of the blacks, maybe even most of the blacks who are in South Africa today, are not from there originally. They're not from that territory. And so the impression that I've had, you tell me if this is right or not, but the impression that I've had is that the whites, the Europeans, have been there for over 400 years. That's my understanding.
That is correct.
They basically built South Africa. And then as this successful territory developed, you had many blacks from other parts of the continent who wanted to come and cash in, find ways to get jobs, be a part of it, etc. Kind of like we've got people coming in from Mexico, pouring in millions because they want to be part of the American dream. And then all of those people, there are these demands to give them equal citizenship,
Right.
is what ultimately gave them the majority there. Is that correct?
No, in this you're absolutely correct, except that the people that are pouring in now are not the ones that have given them the majority. 400 years ago, or 1652 is really the birth date of South Africa. So that's when the whites arrived here. At approximately the same time, black nations were moving down the east coast of Africa and moving into southern Africa as well. So white and black pretty much arrived here at the same time, but from different directions. The whites came from the sea, obviously, from Europe, and the blacks came down Africa. They met and started fighting pretty much because they were such very different cultures. So what I'm getting at is that neither white nor black originally came from here. All of them are settlers. The difference being that the blacks outnumbered the whites hugely because of different nations coming down, whereas the whites coming by sea, it was a small settlement that gradually grew and spread. The ones that have been coming from the rest of Africa in more modern times, there are millions, but they haven't yet swayed the balance of power, you could say, but we're heading in that direction as they get citizenship given to them just because they're here. So yes, it will sway that in time to come very soon.
Do you think that's what I see is what they've done in South Africa? This is what they're trying to do in America with this massive flood of people coming up from the Mexican border. Do you think there's a parallel there?
Very close parallel. I think Rome is, as you know, would be behind what's happening in your country, very much so. And if you look at the similarities and the parallels, you have America, prosperous and first world country, and then you have Latin America with all its problems, all its revolutions, people wanting a better life. So they're coming, but they're being encouraged to come by their priests. Likewise in South Africa, except it's from the north and not from the south. Even today, although the ANC of Mandela has run the country into the ground, the perception in the rest of Africa is that South Africa is still the powerhouse. It is still the land of opportunity. And so they are also being encouraged to come. And so they're pouring in over the borders. So yes, it's the same thing. And the same thing's happening in Europe, only there it's, of course, Muslim immigration being encouraged from North Africa and from East, from the Middle East to come into Europe and do the same thing. So it's to destroy the Protestant West in whatever way they can do it, using the same tactics where they can. Obviously, it's different depending on the circumstances.
Well, what do you think then about what do you think is the solution for all of this? Because what they're using is they're using this this kind of Christian compassion, guilt manipulation. You should let all these people come into your country, and they need help and they need this, and give them free stuff, and that's the charitable thing to do.
Yeah.
How do the historically, I call them historically Christian countries, at least by their profession. What I say to people is, you know, however imperfect they may be, they profess to be Christian. So how do these historically Christian countries combat the massive invasion of really pagans and non-Christians and people who have a completely different value system quite often, where they don't value law and order, they don't value honesty? How do they deal with this?
Well, yeah, that's the big question. On an individual level, first of all, for true Christians that are bombarded with this guilt trip about compassion and all the rest, it is of course true that as Christians we are to show compassion and to help those in need. But a simple way to maybe get it across is to bring it down from country to country and bring it down to neighbor. If my neighbor across the fence here is in need, if his house is burning, if he is hungry, I can help him as far as I can, and I should. And if for a time he needs a place to stay, he can come into my house. But I can't, it's just physically impossible to take in the whole street, every neighbor who has a problem or says he does, and make him welcome in my house. That's not possible, and is not what the scriptures teach when they teach that we are to have compassion anyway. Taking it then to a larger, or looking at the big picture of countries, I honestly don't know if there is anything that we can do unless the Lord sends a heaven-sent revival. And at this stage, there's no sign of that. Not saying that it can't happen. Of course, there are those who say we're in the middle of one, and I completely disagree with that view. I think that we are not. But short of that happening, the people of the Protestant West are they are not what they were. And they are so immoral. They are so biblically illiterate. They are so devoted to their pleasures and their entertainments and their lifestyle that I think it is judgment upon them. And unless the Lord intervenes and sends a mighty revival that changes the hearts of men, it's going to go from bad to worse.
Wow. I mean, Jesus says in the New Testament, he says to his followers, you are the salt of the earth. The salt should lose its savor. It's good for nothing but to be cast out and trampled under the feet of men. I've often wondered, is that what's happening to us here in the West? Have we lost that savor collectively?
Yes, and I think so. And when salt loses its savor, as the Lord said, salt is savory. If it loses it, it's worthless. And we've had these blessings for hundreds of years. By we I mean the majority of those professing to be Christians have despised those blessings in recent times. They've made idols out of entertainment and pleasure, and the Lord is judging them, and rightly so. And again, unless the Lord changes the hearts on a large scale, humanly speaking, I don't see any hope. And this is why I think I mentioned briefly in an email to you, but this is why I believe it's so important for believers to remember that we are strangers and pilgrims in this world, and that we are here to evangelize the lost and to build up the Church of Christ, the true Christian church, which is a remnant today.
All right, now I have to throw out a Bible prophecy question to you, because I know you generally hold to a Reformed view. Is that correct?
It is, without using the term, but yes, I do. A historicist interpretation of prophecy. Yep.
There we go. There we go. Praise the Lord. A fellow historicist. Yeah, I've talked about this on my radio program for years, and most people, when I first started years ago, didn't know what historicism was.
No, they don't.
And so you're definitely not a dispensationalist.
I'm not a dispensationalist. I'm not a futurist, and I'm not a preterist. Very much a historicist.
Yes. Well, we're definitely in agreement there. What do you think about the movement of Reformed Protestantism from the Reformation going into the Puritan era with men like Oliver Cromwell and the English Civil War and what went on, because there were such dramatic changes and events that happened.
Right.
Cromwell through the Glorious Revolution. And so much so, one of the things that I talk about in my film, True Christian History of America, which I know I'm going to send you a copy of, but what I basically do is trace the history of the founding of America back to Europe and England, and the things that were going on from Magna Carta, Alfred the Great onward, talking about the principles of liberty that were handed down.
Right.
And one of the things that we quote is Theodore Roosevelt published a biography on Oliver Cromwell, in which he said that Cromwell's view of an ideal government, while not perfectly achieved in England, was more perfectly achieved with the founding of the United States. That's what he said. But anyway, Cromwell was very, very influential in his writings, quoting the scripture continually. What is your view of the Cromwellian era and his influence in Puritanism?
Right. Okay. Well, if we get into that, there will be some controversy, but let's try. I think it's a mixed bag. I'm grateful for what the Lord in his sovereignty did through that, and as you say, into America, and the influence of some of those things in American history. I'm not, however, taken with the professing Christianity of a lot of what happened in that time, just like in other times in English history. And again, it's because I'm not in favor of any kind of state church or state influence. I'm grateful for what Cromwell did for the Waldensians, and how he financially helped them as much as he did, and basically threatened the papist countries with real problems from England if they carried on persecuting the Waldensians. That's good as far as it goes. That's wonderful. I just think that, well, the whole history of England at that time becomes very complicated. I've often thought I'm glad I wasn't living through it. It's you know, the sides seem to change so quickly. But I think the Lord in his sovereignty used a lot of what happened in the Protestant Reformation and afterwards to do great good in the world, in politics, in economics, in freedoms, of course, in the open Bible, the translation of the Bible. So that part I'm fully supportive of. My problem comes more with the type of Christianity that was predominant at various times there, and that one side would persecute the other. You know, that professing Christians could persecute other Christians is just horrendous. It is so unbiblical that it leaves me cold, really.
No, it's true. That's the there's a quote from Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, American Justice Story, who talked about, or at least his view of the First Amendment in our Constitution, that the real object of the amendment was to prevent any particular denomination of Christianity from getting control of the national government, and to cut off the means of persecution, he said, which was the vice and pest of former ages. But that's what they were looking to do. Yeah. And I always found that to be a very powerful quote.
Yeah, me too. I think that's actually very true. And so that part of American history, truly you can see the Lord's hand in that, and that was prevented. Otherwise, you would have had the same problems manifesting themselves that had cursed Europe for hundreds of years, and it didn't happen. It did in the early part. I mean, in Massachusetts and in other parts of in the very early days, there were state churches there. You know, the Anglicans and the Presbyterians at times were in power and persecuted those who weren't. But then in Rhode Island and Roger Williams and so on, and I think we can thank the Lord that those views predominated and produced in America a country where religious freedom was sacrosanct and has been such a blessing and an encouragement to other parts of the world. You know, we had it, but we didn't have it to that extent. And so it was always something we could look to and say, that's what we'd aspire to be if we could. And that was encouraging to other parts of the Protestant West. Of course, it's all going now, if it hasn't gone already in most places.
Well, I see what I see happening, bringing all of this back to the Jesuits and their Counter-Reformation. There's and I know, at least if you've written about it, I haven't seen your writings on it. I don't know if you've written much about the Jesuits and their promotion of LGBT, and you probably are aware of that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Which is just very, very disturbing, the whole history.
It is. It is.
But they're developing this into a weapon of persecution.
Yep.
In Europe and
Yep.
in America.
Hmm.
Can you speak on that?
Yes, they are, and the Jesuits are very involved in that. In fact, I think it's one of the things that many Roman Catholics and others are very confused by today, because the so-called Church of Rome that they grew up in is not the so-called Church of Rome they're seeing today. Mm-hmm. It is a very, very different place, and that is thanks to the Jesuits. The whole LGBTQ, RST, UVW, alphabet soup thing is just, they are promoting it, and a lot of Roman Catholic people are just, they're shocked. I think it's a great time for evangelism, because they are completely at a loss as to why their priests are supporting something which official canon law says is a grave sin. And they don't understand the bigger picture. And the bigger picture is the destruction of the morals of the West. And apart from anything else, just the Jesuits wanting to keep the Roman Catholic institution up with the times. They wanted to keep with the times, which they have seen are changing towards not only communism, but extreme liberal, radical morality through the LGBT movement. And if they're going to have any relevance, they've got to keep up. So they are quite happy to go along with this, and eventually to change whatever canon laws they can change to make it part of official Roman policy. It's hard to believe because they're in the early stages of that, but that's the way they're going.
Mm. And what do you think about, and I'm sure you write about this, the ecumenical movement, the blending together of all religions into one,
Yeah.
And teaching that Christianity and Islam and Buddhism and so on, that these are somehow or other all one and the same thing. What do you think their ultimate objective is with that?
I think the ultimate objective is to do in the spiritual realm or the religious realm what they are also doing on the political side, which is world control. So the Pope and his Jesuits have looked at the whole world situation and thought, in the modern world, it's not going to be enough to just keep pushing the idea that we are the only truth and everyone must join us. Instead, they would use the interfaith approach of trying to get all the religions. I'm not convinced that they're trying to make them all one fully, because they know the differences are too great, but at least to have some kind of maybe federal situation where the Pope is at the top and the religious leaders of the other religions are in some subservient position to that. I don't know how far they're going to be able to take it, but certainly they want to amalgamate them all as far as they can, still with the Pope of Rome in charge, no doubt about that, but uniting them all in some kind of union, whatever shape that's still going to take. And I think we're not sure which way that's going to go yet, fully. A lot will depend on how far Francis goes with that, and he's an old man, how long he lives and who takes his place. So as to whether it stays on that course or whether it changes direction.
Do you think that Pope Francis is a full-blown socialist communist?
Yes, yeah, I do. I think he is fully that. He won't say it, he won't come out openly and say it, but on political matters and other economic matters, he is a full-blown socialist communist. On certain doctrinal matters, he may be more of a traditionalist some of them, not all of them. But being a Jesuit, he'll be whatever is suitable to the times, and he can change it tomorrow as a true chameleon if he sees the need to. And that's why you can't pin him down. That's why Roman Catholics themselves are so confused by the utterances that he makes. Out of one side of his mouth, he'll say something that sounds like he's against the LGBT movement. Out of another side of his mouth, just a few days later, he'll say something that is clearly supportive of them. And he's doing that on purpose.
Oh yeah, I've talked about that on my my radio show. It's very Jesuitical.
Oh, very, yeah.
Very, yeah. Studying the order, very Jesuitical. It's that plausible deniability.
Yeah.
So they can always say, "Oh, that's not exactly what he said."
Exactly. Yeah.
Very manipulative.
Yeah.
The Webster's dictionaries back in the 1800s used to have, if you look up the word Jesuit or Jesuitical, mm-hmm. would describe them as a deceptive organization.
Right, I know, and other dictionaries did the same. Yeah.
How did that change from there's so much literature from back in the 1800s, right. And yet through the 20th century, it's like most all of it disappeared.
It's gone. Yeah, I think a lot of that is because they infiltrated the Protestant seminaries and universities. And once their own men were professors of theology and all the rest of it, they could quietly sideline those books and get them out. It didn't go along with the ecumenical movement, so the books had to go, and they did.
So you think they changed the history? Or they got rid of it?
Perhaps not changed it, but hidden it, and in the hope that no one will notice. And I think most people don't notice. If you speak to most people, their knowledge of history goes back a few years at most. They're interested in the here and now. They don't care what happened back then, and they don't see the point of it. History has been played down, even in our education systems, to the point where it seems to have no relevance. And I think that's done on purpose, so that people don't care what happened before. They're only interested in now.
Well, one of the principles of Marxism or of Karl Marx is the rewriting of history as the first battleground. And you know this quote where he says, if you rewrite a nation's history and change their heritage, they're easily overthrown.
Yeah.
Did they create a fake history for South Africa?
I think they're in the process of doing that. They didn't do it during the revolution because they were too busy sitting in the bush fighting. But now that they are in power, they are definitely rewriting history. In fact, we've homeschooled our daughters. And when we were looking for history books 20 years ago, trying to find good ones to teach our girls history, we remembered the ones that we had used at school. And the only places we could find those books now were in secondhand bookstores. So the schools, the South African schools, have thrown them out. They don't even have history anymore. I think it comes under life sciences or something like that. And it's all geared towards ANC communist history and the history of Black Africa with no real relevance to white Africa, unless it's to say that they were racists and oppressors. Then it's there.
Wow. And where do you think this all fits in? I know, we've been talking for almost 2 hours now, and I don't want to take up too much of your time, but to bring this around to a closing point, where do you think all of this fits in from your historicist perspective?
Okay.
How do you think it fits in prophetically?
Prophetically, I believe that we are very close to the end. The destruction of the papal system has not yet taken place, but I think it is coming in the near future, and following shortly after that, the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. but when I say shortly, being a historicist, shortly may mean a few years. It may not be within days, but looking at the prophecies of Revelation and following it, I'm actually writing a multi-volume commentary on Revelation, which is nearly finished now. And looking at it, where we are in those prophecies is right near the end. There isn't much time left. I don't want to say that sounding like a futurist. I don't mean it like that, but just that prophetically, there isn't much time left.
Mm. And so what do you think now, because you're also a minister, you're a preacher of the word of God, what would your counsel be to anybody, let's say they're not a true believer, what would you tell people who are seeing, because more and more people are waking up to the threat of globalism. And maybe they didn't believe it 10 or 20 years ago, but now as they're seeing things happen and these upheavals around the world, they're recognizing that what the so-called conspiracy theorists were saying 20 years ago is true. They're looking for answers. What would you tell them?
Well, I think the first thing I'd tell them is make sure that you have your priorities straight on this. These things are very important while we live in this earth, but eternity, none of this will matter. And so most important is to make your calling and election sure, as Peter says in 2 Peter chapter 1. Are you a child of God by faith in Jesus Christ? That is the most important matter, because this world passes by very quickly, and the 70 or 80 years we have on it, it's soon over, and then there is eternity. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing, as far as this earth is concerned, is to live as salt and light in the world, to do what you can to make it a better place. I don't want to sound like some 1970s hippie in saying that, but what I mean by that is to live out our Christian life in the world, so that as far as we can, we make it a nicer place to live in, a more decent and moral place to live in. But at the same time, to keep in mind that we are strangers and pilgrims in this world, and that this world is not our home ultimately. And while we have a work to do here, and it's an important work, but nothing is as important as the state of your soul. And what shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul?
So believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you shall be saved.
Yes.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. Well, Shawn, I am going to go ahead and close our interview section here.
Okay.
I'm just going to stop recording for the sake of stopping the recording, but then we can talk for a few minutes until we need to go here. All right, so I'm going to stop or pause recording.